Are we talking about mental health now?
Nice.
I mean, we could.
And that, I think, is very inspirational for many people.
But since we're talking about corporates, it's the balance sheet that you don't see.
And I think it's for us as leaders to really start empathizing with mental health issues.
I think leaders need to be more vulnerable.
I think it's going to be very powerful.
Kiran and Anand, I wanted to start by asking, what does mental health mean to the both of you?
I, for one, believe that we have ignored mental health in a big way all these decades. And we know it's there. We know that there's a huge stigma associated with mental illness. And I just felt that we ought to do something about it because like any disease, it's manageable, it's treatable.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I got so involved in and interested in mental health. And I really got very interested in helping with your initiative and your mission of addressing this space.
Anand?
For me, I think mental health is a little bit, since we're talking about corporates, it's the balance sheet that you don't see. I think everybody looks at the P&L, but you hardly look at the balance sheet. So it's mental health at a personal level is really about well-being.
Yeah.
But I think at the company and the community level, it's about taking care and making sure you get a return later. But it is important to take care of. And it's hidden, you don't see it every day. A physical ailment is much easier, like Kiran said, to actually take care of. But this you don't see.
Yep.
So I think really taking care of that, both at a company, at a community, and a personal level is incredibly important, which is also a little bit the reason, I think, to get involved, I think, in the foundation.
With the foundation. In your opinion, do you believe that the perception of mental health has evolved or changed in the workplace or in the startup community, say in the last couple of years? And if it has, then how?
I think, Deepika, it has. Firstly, I think post-pandemic, there is now more awareness on mental health. I'll talk a little bit about startups, right, since I've just sort of been over the last 7-8 years. I feel like the pandemic actually caused a little bit of a spurt in issues, I think, right, isolation, not actually having a community that you can connect with, etc. And I think there's more awareness, I think, when people are coming back into work. So I think that's the positive. I do think, however, startups in general, I think there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress, a lot of unknowns, right? And therefore the propensity to actually have stress automatically happen is high. And I think we need to be doing a lot more about it, right? And I think we need to be talking a lot more about it. I mean, I'll tell you at Mensa, for example, we do have a helpline, we do have resources, but how many people actually take advantage of it? How many people actually call? I think there's still stigma associated with it. And I think that needs to be addressed and needs to be led from the front. I think leaders need to be more vulnerable. Leaders need to open up.
Yeah.
I think we need to make managers a lot more empathetic, which we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
That combination, I think, needs to, progress a lot more. But I think we have a good beginning. I think there is some momentum now, much more than I saw maybe 5-7 years ago. So I think to that extent it's improving, but a lot more work to be done.
So you're saying the facilities are available, maybe not to all startups, but at least at Mensa you do.
Right.
But I think you also want to create a culture where people feel safe. And feel safe in a way that they feel vulnerable, where they can share and don't feel judged, don't feel like they're going to lose their jobs, and be able to communicate.
Yeah. Resources, I would say, are a third of the problem. I think 2/3 of the problem is the culture that you mentioned.
Correct.
I think the big thing you have to sort of, emphasize is your career is not going to get impacted if you're vulnerable and take help about mental health. And I think the only way you can change that is actually to start from the top. I think if me and my direct team actually can't be vulnerable and can't talk about it and communicate, I think then it becomes very difficult for somebody to open up because they feel like there'll be some bias, right? At some review, somebody will say, oh, is this the person who's going to get the next big opportunity?
Correct.
And I think that is the part that I think we need to change. And I think that's I think the cultural change.
But is that possible, Anand? Because the startup world and the startup community is so fast-paced.
Yeah.
and it's easy to talk about work-life balance, but is that truly possible?
No, I think it's a great question. I don't know whether work-life balance is fully possible because you're taking somebody else's money, you need a return on invested capital. I think return on investment in mental health is something that I think is a metric that I think is worth introducing. I think lots of studies done, but 20-30% productivity goes away in organizations when mental health issues are there.
Yeah.
So I think it is actually, it makes financial sense.
Correct. Also. While
To do
also
it-
looking at it through the lens of empathy.
Absolutely. So I'm saying as far as investors and startups are concerned, I think painting the picture of productivity and improvement is important. And I think as leaders and managers, I think the empathy is important.
Yeah.
I think both need to get done.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think taking off from what you've said, I mean, you've said most of it, but I would say yes, I think the pandemic has brought a lot of focus on mental health issues. Corporates have not quite understood the stress level that both aspiration and competition brings. Post the pandemic, I think the corporate world has understood the magnitude of health issues.
Yeah.
I mean, mental health issues. So when we talk about attrition, all this actually, the root cause is stress.
Right.
And you need to see how you can address that stressful environment that people operate in. The second thing is, I think, being empathetic to high performers, especially when they start absenting themselves from work, when they start becoming reclusive, when they start disengaging at various levels. Those are early warning signs. And very often such sort of behavioral changes often are dealt with in a very severe manner. And very often people resign, people leave the organization, but that's not really the solution. At least at our organization, we have actually started detecting and diagnosing these early warning signals. We've been very empathetic. And believe me, when you do that, they really, appreciate the corporate backing they get, and they come back much, much stronger. And in fact, their performance levels even increase. So I think he's right. It's about investing in mental health because there's a huge return on that investment. And I think when you do your annual health checkups, I really think mental health ought to be part of that.
Part of it.
Great point.
Why do you think it took us a pandemic to realize the value or the importance of focusing on our mental health, not just as individuals, but also as organizations?
Because I think as people, as societies and as organizations, there's always been a stigma associated with mental health. It's only during the pandemic that all this came to the fore. So in a way, I think we should be grateful to the pandemic.
Yeah,
to actually...
better late than never. But what are some of in your opinion, what are some of the tools that organizations and startups can use to sort of help their teams, their organizations, their people?
So I personally think, to Anand's point, I think you really need to sensitize managers to be more empathetic. I think managers can be very transactional and very ruthless. And I think often that also causes a lot of problems.
Yeah.
So I think you need managers to be more empathetic. We are just talking about people in general, but believe me, women also have it very hard. So I think very often we realize that women have a very tough work-life balance.
Yeah.
Very often I think women, although
harder.
we say that they are great multitaskers,
It does
the
take a
fact
toll.
is it is not that easy.
Yes.
What also the pandemic has taught us is that there is a remote working model that works effectively.
Yeah.
And I think we should take full advantage of that. I think organizations do need to look at a work-life balance, not in terms of what we think of as a work-life balance, but in terms of a balance between remote and on-site working.
Right.
Many, of course, functions may not be possible, like a manufacturing operation, but many others can do that, and we should look at that. It's not necessary for people to come to work or to the office every day. But does that create a better work-life balance is the question. Especially for women, I think this is quite important. Secondly, I think having a lot of helplines, having a very important focus on mental health, which is talked about quite openly, will remove the stigma from this whole area. So I think corporations can do a lot, but also I think the most important aspect of corporate training, corporate behavior is about empathy.
Yeah. Maybe just, Kiran, just to add to that, I fully agree on the empathy and the training of the managers part. I think a few other things that we do. So I think the mechanics of having helpline, making it confidential, making it third party, etc. I think most companies can and should do because one, it doesn't cost that much, and it's easy to implement. I think the cultural part of making sure that you can actually use it is the hard part, which I think is what you need to train your managers on. A few other things that we try and do. One is, I think, to provide a little bit more meaning to the hard work that you actually have, right? I mean, you work very hard, but you're not working hard generally just because you have to work hard. You work hard for a purpose.
Correct.
The second thing that we have tried is creating communities which are interest groups. I mean, we have a breakfast walk interest group. We have a soccer group. We have a badminton group. And I think these start to create a bit of communities. Employee engagement. And the reason I'm saying this, Kiran, is one, I mean, the average age at a Mensa, for example, is 24, 25. And 80% of your life is actually work.
Yeah.
Right? And therefore, to help them create a community, this becomes an instant community for you.
Yeah.
So we try a bit of that, and that
again,
engagement
it goes
helps.
back to our earlier discussion at a personal level, that engagement with family and friends is so important.
It's so important.
So it's the same concept.
You're saying, but it's exactly the same concept, but you're creating that within because you've sort of...
You're moving away from your family and friends, and this is your family away from...
Correct.
That's right.
From your,
That's right. So I think those are the two maybe additions in addition to managers and empathy. Right?
Yeah, and I think what is most important, I feel, Anant and Deepika, is that how do we at a corporate level remove the stigma?
Yeah.
Nobody is, worried about sharing with anyone that they suffer from diabetes.
Correct.
Or any other kind
That's
of...
a conversation we're always having. Yeah.
Right? Or even cardiovascular disease. People are very sympathetic and helpful. So why should they feel, worried about sharing with others that they have a mental health issue? That's what corporate India or corporates in general around the world should do, is to try and remove that, stigma from mental health.
It's like the airplanes, right? I'm going to use this analogy where, you have the oxygen mask, you have to first put it on for yourself.
Yeah.
And then you put it on for the passengers around you. So I think if the senior leaders don't do it, it's very hard to take stigma away. I think just being involved with Live, Love, Laugh at the Mensa level has made a huge difference because people actually, by the way, believe that you can come and talk about mental health.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think actions count louder than words. So being able to have that conversation and making sure that the first person that has that conversation is actually successful and it's actually beneficial to that person, it has made one big difference. And second is, I think, just the fact that the three of us are having this conversation, I think will help, is my sense. Because at least, you hear people talk about the fact that it's okay. It's okay. And I think, by the way, I'll tell you, I've sort of done the professional consultant, I've been the CEO, and now it's like founder, and it gets lonelier and lonelier, right?
Yeah.
And you don't want to talk about the fact that you are vulnerable in any manner, because it's just hard to do so, right? Because you're also pushing people on this, somebody else is pushing you on something, so you don't want to talk about it. I think the minute you get over there and talk about it, I think suddenly gates open up. And I think your directs start to actually talk about the fact that there are issues, and then their directs too. And that's how it spreads in the organization, I think.
No, and to your point, Anant, I think it also helps me to actually, sensitize people and socialize the advocacy around mental health in my company. And I know that at Biocon, we often have an opportunity to talk about different aspects of healthcare. And one thing I do talk about is the Live, Love, Laugh experience that I have, especially in rural India.
Correct.
And there I've often talked to people saying, do you know what? our efforts have yielded in rural India? Do you know that people, and they know how what a huge stigma there is in rural India, much more than in urban India, and how we have basically reintegrated these people into the economic mainstream.
Yeah.
How individuals who have otherwise been sort of ostracized and isolated from society have come back to society. And that, I think, is very inspirational for many people. And that motivates many people to talk about mental health issues in a much more open way than they would have in the past. So I think things are changing.
Yeah. I think the more open we are as leaders, set an example for, for the rest of our teams
And
and for our
thank you
organization.
for starting this whole conversation, because, without your coming out in the open, I don't think the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation would have started. And I think that was the start of it all for all of us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
What more do you think organizations and startups can do to better their already existing systems?
I would say, I think in most startups, for example, I don't think there is a conversation about mental health at all. You will talk about funding, you'll talk about evaluation, you'll talk about a growth number, but you never talk about mental health, right? So I think just having awareness, I think, is the first big step. And I think there is more that needs to happen. I think just as startups, I mean, there are organizations today in I think the corporate world, the CIIs of the world, etc., actually do some of this. I think for startups, I think since it's so early, some of that is not there. But I think one big thing is just as an industry, having us talk more about it and being aware of it, I think will help. And I think if you're not aware and don't measure, then nothing happens. So I think that's one big thing I think that can happen. It creates transparency, right? I think the second one is, I think just willing to invest even a little bit. Most times you don't know what the cost is.
Monetarily?
Monetarily, right? And I think they're small investments, but I think they yield a large return. And I think a lot of times you don't make those small investments, right? It doesn't cost that much to get a help. It doesn't cost that much to create a employee engagement program, Kiran, that we talked about. But just doing that, and therefore, one of the things we have done is we have a terrific person who leads our people function. And I think, see, in every organization, there are some triggers. We talked about the CEO and the founder being one. I think the people function can be another. And I think if you can have someone enlightened there or actually teach them, then it becomes a fulcrum for a lot of change that happens to the rest of the organization. I think the third, by the way, is actually investors and venture capital investors, right? In particular, as you think about startups, I think talking to them about this and getting them involved is also interesting.
How?
I think it has to be in a numerical way, Deepika, in my view. I think it has to be a return that I think they see, which we spoke about earlier. I do think there's a return. I just think it's a matter of showing them and measuring, right? And I think having that conversation with them will also start to change the dialogue around it.
Just taking off from where you said, first and foremost, you're talking about startups. If you think about corporates, larger companies, I think we keep talking about trying to diagnose attrition, right? And a large part of that attrition actually has to do with certain aspects of mental health issues, which we never recognize. I mean, we don't even want to recognize it. How do we basically ensure that, workplaces are measured by the employee engagement levels? And here, I really think that one
When there's too much talking but very little being said, too many voices but hardly any being heard, you turn to a show that puts you front and center. A show that headlines the stories of the people, by the people, for the people.
Look at such organizations saying that these organizations are stable, sustainable, and long-lasting. That's the way they look at it. And all this comes from the fact that you are a close-knit group, you are a caring group, there is empathy. That's why people stay with those organizations.
What is that one last message that you would want to share with your community?
Empathy. I think we spoke a lot about it. I think if there's one word, I would say empathy and leading from the front. Empathy and leading from the front.
Nice.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's really about understanding that, investing in mental health care is investing for a much more sustainable business.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the way I would look at it, saying that if you ignore it, I don't think you can, be prepared for the future.
Anant and Kiran, thank you so much for this conversation. I've definitely taken a lot back from this, and I hope all of our viewers have too. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Deepika.